Hello everyone. Let's take a moment to look at what's happening right now, because it's far more significant than it might appear at first glance. For the past few days, a high-level diplomatic meeting has been taking place in Florida, involving a sitting head of government and a U.S. president, marking their fifth meeting this year. In fact, both sides have described this discussion as part of ongoing efforts to address regional stability. The timing is crucial. The region is already under strain, tensions are heightened, and this conversation is taking place precisely amidst that environment. Official statements suggest the focus is on how to move from a temporary pause in instability to something more sustainable. Historically, preventing immediate instability is one challenge, but creating a workable future over the long term is a very different challenge. Now, when we talk about conditions on the ground, this is where it's important to slow down and be precise. Different organizations release different assessments, and those figures are often debated. Rather than focusing on any single claim, it's safer to rely on what major humanitarian agencies broadly agree on. Large-scale displacement, significant damage to housing and essential services, and extremely difficult living conditions for civilians. Recent reporting also mentions severe weather, including heavy rainfall and colder temperatures, which has further complicated daily life. According to publicly available reporting, one side continues to play a major role in overseeing security arrangements and the flow of assistance, while international organizations emphasize the urgency of meeting basic civilian needs. That balance remains difficult, and it helps explain why progress is often slow. From a media analysis perspective, reporting on regional affairs often emphasizes uncertainty rather than clear outcomes. Various international news outlets have noted that discussions around long-term regional stability continue to attract attention, particularly in areas where diplomatic relationships remain complex. In official public communications, representatives from Iran have, at times, described historical disagreements with countries such as the United States, Israel, and several European nations using firm diplomatic language. On the other hand, statements released by Israeli officials ahead of high-level meetings have generally focused on policy continuity and long-standing security principles, as they are commonly outlined in official briefings. This overview does not evaluate or endorse any position. It is presented solely as an examination of how public messaging is typically framed in formal government communications based on widely available media reporting. On the American side, there's another layer that receives less public attention. Reporting from U.S. media suggests some officials are quietly frustrated with the pace of diplomatic progress. Analysts from established research institutions note that the proposed next phase, introducing a more technocratic, internationally supported administrative framework, sounds practical on paper but is difficult to implement. It requires regional cooperation, credible security arrangements, sustained funding, and leadership that is broadly accepted on the ground. When timelines like early next year are mentioned, it's best understood as an objective rather than a guarantee, reflecting how complex international efforts typically unfold. Within Israel, domestic politics continue alongside diplomatic discussions. Elections are expected within the next year, and publicly available polling indicates growing pressure on the current governing coalition. Much of this pressure comes from debates over security policy, civic responsibilities, and long-standing legal and ethical questions. This visit to Florida therefore serves multiple purposes. Publicly, it focuses on regional coordination. Domestically, it also signals that diplomatic ties with Washington remain strong. Historically, leaders on both sides tend to avoid public disagreements during moments like this, recognizing the strategic value of appearing aligned. Look, I want to start with something that seems obvious, but is often overlooked when we talk about large-scale research datasets in any field. The fact is, independent research organizations, that is, the analysts working at universities and think tanks, compile these records from publicly available information across many different fields. This is a verifiable fact. What they present is not the complete picture of everything, it's event-based data that shows patterns in specific categories, and I think that's where the confusion begins. People see the numbers and charts and assume they're seeing the whole story, but these data sets are deliberately limited to specific, clearly defined parameters. Meanwhile, Countless other factors are tracked in entirely different ways, and if you don't understand this distinction, you start drawing conclusions that the data wasn't designed to support. So, the real story here isn't about what the numbers show, it's about what they can't show, and that's a limitation we need to consider for a moment. From a research and academic reporting perspective, it is crucial to clarify that data is not designed to present a complete or absolute version of reality, but rather to document how information is collected, organized, and structured, particularly in complex or challenging situations. Not every real-world factor can be neatly captured in a spreadsheet or database, and when structured data is treated as the absolute truth, the analysis can be incomplete or misleading. This is why responsible research practices caution against viewing surface-level trends as inherently meaningful, instead recognizing that datasets typically provide only a limited, systematic snapshot of a much broader reality, reflecting the collection process, the frameworks used, and the inherent limitations, rather than everything that is happening beyond what has been measured. Therefore, careful researchers differentiate between what is recorded and what exists outside the dataset, understanding that this distinction is a known limitation rather than a flaw. For this reason, the most methodologically sound question to ask when reviewing reports is not, "What does this prove?" but "What information is less than I, is greater than not, is less than I, is greater than captured here?" An approach that strengthens accurate interpretation, ethical analysis, and informed decision-making without dismissing the research itself. From a research reporting perspective, and I think it's important to state this explicitly, the purpose of data is not to represent the complete or absolute reality of any situation. It's primarily to explain how information was collected, organized, and structured, especially in challenging environments, and since not every detail of the real world can easily fit into a spreadsheet or database, when structured data is treated as the whole truth, the analysis can quietly go astray. That's why responsible research practices, urge us to be cautious about drawing conclusions from high-level trends, because most datasets provide only a limited and systematic snapshot of a much larger reality, reflecting the limitations of the methods, frameworks, and what was measured, not everything that's happening beyond that. A careful researcher understands this gap between what is recorded and what exists outside the data, and this gap is not a failure, it's a known limitation. Therefore, when reviewing reports, the more responsible question isn't, "What does this prove?" but rather, "What might be missing here?" Because that kind of thinking helps in drawing accurate inferences, conducting ethical analysis, and making informed decisions without dismissing the research altogether. And let's clarify something that is often misunderstood when discussing long-term data and professional reporting. The first step is understanding who is actually collecting this information. In many industries, professional associations regularly document what their members experience over time, such as working conditions, operational limitations, and environmental factors affecting daily work. The second step is recognizing what this data represents. These records are internal documentation, not independent investigations or external audits. They reflect how the organization perceives the ongoing challenges in its field. The third step is separating confirmed observations from interpretations. When these reports mention issues like access difficulties or limited resources, they are generally referring to broader structural pressures rather than specific incidents. And finally, the key point is this. The verified fact is that a professional body has shared its records regarding operational challenges, while any broader conclusions remain contextual and should be understood as analysis, not definitive proof.